20 ugliest cars of the 1970s. 1. 1970 AMC Gremlin. The car that should have stayed in the concept phase. If you think small cars can't be ugly, well, AMC was about to prove you wrong with the Gremlin. This oddball was part of a desperate attempt by the American Motors Corporation to break into the small car market. The idea seemed simple enough: make a small, affordable car that would appeal to budget-conscious buyers. But instead of sleek or compact, the Gremlin came out looking like it was the result of an argument between two very different design philosophies. The proportions were all wrong, with a long, awkward nose that seemed to be overcompensating for the body, which was squished and boxy. The rear end in particular was comically out of place, as if someone had tried to attach a tail to a mishmash of random car parts. The funny part? AMC actually considered a shortened version of the Gremlin, which according to their design chief, Dick Teague, was even uglier. Yes, that's the man who signed off on this monstrosity, so we're not sure how much faith we can put in his opinion about what looks good. Still, the Gremlin sold well enough for AMC to get some street cred, even if it was only as a punchline. Despite being a sales success, the Gremlin forever remains a weird part of car history, not because it was ahead of its time or technologically groundbreaking, but because it was ugly in a way that makes you wonder what the designers were even thinking. 2. 1970 Buick Riviera, the beautiful dream that turned into a nightmare. The Buick Riviera of the 1960s was a stunning example of American luxury, with its elegant curves, hidden headlights, and graceful stance. But come 1970, Buick decided to make some updates to the Riviera. What they ended up with was a complete disaster. The car's design took a drastic, misguided turn into the world of bloat, with proportions that were all over the place. From the front, the Riviera looked like the grille was melting down the body, a visual disaster that defied basic design principles. The rear fenders, which were supposed to look elegant, ended up looking like a disease-ridden blob, sagging over the wheels in a desperate attempt to add bulk where there was no need for it. The whole car felt bloated, as though the designers had no idea how to stop adding things. What was once a luxurious, sleek vehicle turned into something that looked more like a bloated corpse trying to stay afloat in a pool of bad ideas. The worst part is that the Riviera's once promising legacy was marred by this atrocity, and Buick was forced to replace it with the boat-tail Riviera in 1971, thankfully a much more graceful design. 3. 1970 Ford Thunderbird, the car that lost its wings. Ford's Thunderbird had been a symbol of American automotive sophistication in the 1960s, but 1970 marked a massive shift. What was once a beautiful car became a bloated mess with a front end that looked more like an angry bird's beak than a sleek, stylish automobile. The decision to slap this monstrous, protruding nose on the Thunderbird was nothing short of baffling. The whole design was a sharp departure from the smooth lines and elegant silhouette the T-Bird was known for, making the 1970 model look more like a parody of itself than a worthy successor. The Thunderbird's wide stance and sharp beak were designed to make it stand out, but instead it looked like a car trying to compensate for something it lacked. Instead of exuding the feeling of flight that its name suggested, this Thunderbird looked like it had crashed headfirst into a wall. The design was jarring, unbalanced, and ultimately unnecessary. The T-Bird, which once represented sleek American luxury, became a clumsy and awkward attempt to modernize a classic. In the end, the 1970 Ford Thunderbird is remembered as one of the most misguided efforts in automotive history, proving that sometimes less really is more. 4. 1970 Porsche 914, a dorky disaster with a heart of gold. Now, Porsche is known for its performance cars, but the 914 was a strange detour on that road. It wasn't just a design mess. It was a car that looked so awkwardly proportioned that even the most die-hard Porsche enthusiasts couldn't fully embrace it. The 914 was a mid-engine sports car, but from the moment you laid eyes on it, You could tell something was off. The long, awkward gap between the rear wheel and the B-pillar made the 914 look like a car with an identity crisis. The lines were flat. The rear end looked like it was tacked on as an afterthought. And the shape was as if someone had tried to build a sports car with a ruler and no sense of proportion. It didn't have the sleek, aggressive lines you'd expect from a Porsche, but instead it had an awkward, almost goofy charm. And yet there was something endearing about the Porsche 914's lack of self-awareness. It accepted its dorkiness, perhaps even embraced it. But while some people might call that charm, we'd argue it just wasn't the Porsche most people were dreaming of. It's a fun little car, yes, but not the kind of thing you'd put on a poster above your bed. Five, 1970 Saab Sonnet. 3. A front end that wasn't meant to be seen. The Saab Sonnet 3 was one of those cars that had a vision, but somehow missed the mark entirely. It was meant to appeal to the American market with its distinctive European styling, but what it ended up with was something downright strange. The Sonnet's long, bulbous front end seemed more like a joke than an attempt at cutting-edge design. The proportions were completely out of whack, with the front overhang so exaggerated that the car looked more like a parody of a sports car than the real thing. The front bumper, seemingly an afterthought, looked more like a hasty addition than an intentional design feature. Meanwhile, the short, squat rear end just made the car look even more awkward. The Sonnet's design didn't appeal to anyone, especially Americans, who didn't know what to make of its elongated nose and shrunken tail. Saab, trying to play on the idea of sporty European vehicles, ended up with a car that was neither sporty nor appealing. It was a lost opportunity that failed to find a place in the market. 6. 1972. Subaru GL Coupe. Who thought this was a good idea? Subaru's GL Coupe was a car with an identity crisis. It looked like a weird compromise between a sporty coupe and an everyday commuter car. The design wasn't cohesive at all, and the proportions were bizarre, particularly in the rear. The body seemed too long for its own good, and the odd, shortened rear end made the car look unfinished. It's almost like Subaru got the dimensions wrong when they shipped the car, and instead of fixing it, they just called it a day. The result was a car that looked awkward and out of place on the road, with a chopped-up body that didn't belong anywhere. It wasn't sporty enough to be exciting, and wasn't practical enough to be a sensible daily driver. Ultimately, the GL Coupe was a forgettable blip in Subaru's history. One of those cars you can't help but feel sorry for, but also can't quite understand why it ever existed in the first place. 7. 1973. Leyland P76. The wedge-shaped wonder of regret. When we think of British cars from the 1970s, elegance is not exactly the first word that comes to mind. And if you want to see what happens when bad design decisions and poor quality control come together, look no further than the Leyland P76. This car had the design of a wedge with all the grace of a rock in a blender. Its sharp, angular body was a throwback to an era when designers thought that adding more edges would somehow make a car look more modern. The end result was a bulky, awkward machine that looked like it was trying and failing to be futuristic. To make matters worse, Leyland's notorious lack of quality control meant that the car was just as poorly built as it was unattractive. The P76 was the kind of car that made you question whether the folks at British Leyland were in the business of building cars, or just giving up on humanity altogether. It sold poorly and for good reason. Nobody wanted to drive a car that looked like a bad sculpture. 8. 1973. Reliant Robin. The three-wheeled disaster. Ah, the Reliant Robin. Perhaps the most famous three-wheeled car in history. It's hard to overstate just how absurd this vehicle was. Looking more like a half-hearted attempt at a car than an actual car, the Robin was a tiny, three-wheeled disaster, with a cheap plastic body that flexed in the wind and a front end that looked like it was perpetually about to collapse under the weight of its own ridiculousness. The Reliant Robin was anything but practical. The proportions were off, the design was uninspired, and worst of all, it was unstable. The one wheel in the front and two in the back made it prone to tipping over, turning it into a rolling joke. Whether you love it or hate it, there's no denying that the Reliant Robin cemented its place in history as one of the most comically flawed cars to ever exist. 9. 1974. Bricklin SV1, safety first, style last. The Bricklin SV1 was a car that placed an unnecessary emphasis on safety, which is admirable, but it came at the cost of, well, everything else. Designed by an ex-Canada-based businessman, the Bricklin tried to blend futuristic aesthetics with the safety-first mentality. The gull-wing doors look cool in theory, but in practice they only added to the awkwardness of the entire design. The car's proportions were all wrong, with a bulbous, overly angular body that looked more like a toy car than something you'd see on the road. The bumpers were unnecessarily bulky, and the rear end seemed to be designed as a brick wall of ugly. The SV1's inability to blend the safety features with aesthetics ultimately led to its failure. 10. 1974. Ford Pinto, the exploding tragedy. The Ford Pinto is notorious for its explosive reputation. The Pinto wasn't designed to blow up, but its gas tank design made it incredibly dangerous in rear-end crashes, leading to multiple fatalities. Instead of correcting the issue, Ford initially tried to cover it up, which led to a massive public backlash. Its design was simple and unremarkable. Just a basic compact car with a bland look and a troubling safety flaw. Its legacy is forever tainted by the dangerous flaws that should have never been there. The Pinto didn't just look bad, it literally could kill you. 11. 1974. Chevy Vega, a rusting bucket of fail. The Chevy Vega was a car that didn't quite live up to the hype. Although it was marketed as an affordable, compact car, it had major issues with rusting, which became a huge problem for owners. The bodywork would start to corrode within a few years of use, and the engine often had trouble holding up over time. It was a prime example of a car that was rushed into production without adequate testing or quality control. The Vega's cheap materials and poor craftsmanship ultimately made it a huge disappointment in the eyes of buyers. 12th. 1976. Cadillac Seville, luxury gone wrong. The 1976 Cadillac Seville was an attempt by the luxury brand to enter the compact market. However, the results were less than impressive. While it tried to maintain Cadillac's reputation for luxury, it ended up feeling cramped and cheap. The car's design was boxy and uninspired, especially for a brand known for elegant, flowing lines. The Seville didn't offer much in terms of style, and its attempt to be compact only made it feel awkward and uncomfortable. It looked like Cadillac tried too hard to downsize without thinking through the design. 13. 1975. AMC Pacer, a fishbowl on wheels. The AMC Pacer was one of the most bizarre cars ever made. It had an unusually wide body with large windows, making it resemble a fishbowl on wheels. The unique design was supposed to offer more interior space, but instead it just made the car look awkward and out of place. The Pacer's appearance was so strange that it gained a cult following, but for all the wrong reasons. Despite the quirky appeal, it was difficult to see it as anything other than a design mistake that failed to catch on with mainstream buyers. 1977. Ford Fiesta, a subcompact that didn't fit. The Ford Fiesta was Ford's answer to the growing demand for subcompact cars. Unfortunately, the car's design didn't make much of an impact in the U.S. market. The Fiesta's proportions were awkward, with its squat, stubby appearance making it look less like a sporty little car and more like an underdeveloped prototype. Although it had a somewhat practical design, it lacked the appeal or excitement that would make it a hit. The Fiesta's low-riding stance and boxy look made it unremarkable and uninspiring in a market full of more stylish and innovative cars. 15. 1978 Dodge Aspen, a big mistake in a small package. The Dodge Aspen was part of Chrysler's ill-fated attempt to jump into the compact car market. While it looked like a traditional American sedan, the Aspen suffered from terrible build quality. The design was plain and unattractive, with cheap materials and poor engineering. It was known for developing mechanical issues early in its life, and many owners complained about the car's frequent breakdowns. The Aspen never gained a strong following, and its short-lived existence left a lasting mark as one of Chrysler's failed attempts to compete with other, more reliable compacts. 16. 1979 Datsun 210, a cheap attempt at compact success. The Datsun 210 was a budget-friendly compact car designed to provide basic transportation, but it was far from a stylish or exciting option. The car was boxy, underpowered, and had an interior that felt more like a plastic shell than anything remotely comfortable. The 210's design didn't excite anyone. It was basic to the point of being forgettable. While it offered some efficiency, it was clear that Datsun had not prioritized anything beyond the bare minimum in terms of design and comfort, making it a lackluster option in the compact car market. 17. 1979 Renault Le Car, a French misstep in the U.S. market. The Renault Le Car was an attempt to introduce a quirky European hatchback to the American market, but it didn't exactly win over American consumers. The car was small and had a unique, boxy shape, but it didn't resonate with American buyers, who were used to larger, more powerful cars. While the Le Car was efficient and affordable, its odd design and limited appeal made it an uncomfortable fit for the U.S. market. The car's lack of refinement and design sophistication left it feeling like a low-budget alternative to more established subcompacts. 18. 1978 Buick Skyhawk, a poor man's Camaro. The Buick Skyhawk was essentially a budget version of the Chevrolet Camaro, and it was as underwhelming as it sounds. It lacked the power and performance of the Camaro, and the design was far less aggressive. The body was small and somewhat awkward, with the car's proportions looking off compared to its sportier counterpart. The Skyhawk didn't offer the excitement that a performance car should have, and as a result, it became a forgotten vehicle in Buick's lineup. The car's attempt at being a sporty coupe fell flat, making it a dull choice for buyers seeking something with more flair. 1976 Mercury Monarch, a forgotten face in the crowd. The Mercury Monarch was a mid-sized sedan that never quite fit in with its competition. While other sedans were getting sleeker and more refined, the Monarch seemed like a dated throwback to a previous era. The design was boxy and unremarkable, with a front end that looked uninspired and a rear end that was completely forgettable. The Monarch never attracted a strong following and faded into obscurity, remembered only as a bland and unsuccessful attempt by Mercury to compete with more modern sedans. Its lack of identity made it a true automotive ghost. 1977 Pontiac Astrea, a small car with a big fail. The Pontiac Astor was Pontiac's answer to the subcompact car craze, but it failed miserably. Designed on the same platform as the Chevrolet Vega, it inherited all of the Vega's problems, chiefly rusting and poor engine performance. The Astor's design was just as uninspired, with a dull, boxy body that didn't excite anyone. Although it was inexpensive and practical, it couldn't escape the reputation of being a poorly made car with serious mechanical flaws. The Astra's failure is a classic example of a car that was doomed from the start due to poor design and execution.